The royal family has always been professional cover-uppers. That's not editorial opinion. It's how their own subjects describe them. But the playbook they deployed for Prince Andrew was written almost a century ago, for a prince most of you have never heard of. Some say there was never a cover-up at all. Prince George's grandchildren are alive. His children, Edward, Duke of Kent, Princess Alexandra, and Prince Michael of Kent, all grew up as recognized, visible members of the royal family. Edward is 90 years old and attended the launch of a biography about himself in October 2025 at a venue in London with personal significance to his parents. His sister Alexandra still carries out royal engagements. The family didn't erase the man. They gave his children his titles. That is the strongest version of the privacy argument. Why would children speak publicly about a parent's drug use and sexual history? The silence could be grief and dignity, not machinery. Here is what personal privacy can't explain. The Sunday Post investigated and confirmed that no authorized biography of Prince George, Duke of Kent, has ever been commissioned, and that the palace and his family have given all approaches short shrift. For a royal of his rank, fourth son of a king, Air Commodore, serving diplomat, dead in active service at 39, that is extraordinary. Edward VIII has an authorized biography. George VI has several. Even minor royals of that generation have been written about with institutional blessing. George has none. In 2022, Index on Censorship confirmed that historic files on the royal family are unavailable to researchers, with access denied for reasons described as absurd. German historian Carina Urbach of the Institute of Historical Research at the University of London and author of Go-Betweens for Hitler has stated publicly that documentation on the monarchy's connections to Hitler is being withheld and may well have been destroyed. Some royal correspondence remains sealed with a release date of 2041. A family can be visible. Their father's papers can still be inaccessible. The machine doesn't erase people. It erases records. George Edward Alexander Edmund was born on December 20th, 1902, at York Cottage on the Sandringham Estate in Norfolk, the fourth son of King George V. He was, by common account, the most intellectually capable of his siblings, the brightest of the brothers, with a gift for languages, a genuine passion for the arts, and what Christopher Warwick, who wrote the only biography of George and Marina, described as the most interesting, intelligent, and cultivated sensibility of his generation. He spoke French and Italian. He played the piano well. He drove sports cars too fast. He spent 14 years in the Royal Navy despite chronic seasickness, which tells you something about how much choice royal sons had in career selection. When the Navy and George finally parted company in 1929, the official account cited the seasickness. A more recent account noted the admirals had grown tired of his bad behavior and general disregard for the rules. Both versions are probably accurate. After the Navy, he worked at the Foreign Office and then the Home Office, becoming the first member of the British royal family to serve as a civil servant. His designated role? Factory inspector. The pin-up prince of the Roaring Twenties was technically assigned to review working conditions in industrial England. He drove his sports cars there too. His father, King George V, found him exhausting. His brother Edward, Prince of Wales, found him a kindred spirit. In Edward's memoir, A King's Story, published in 1951, he wrote that though George was 8.5 years his junior, he found in his character qualities that were akin to his own, that they became more than brothers, they became close friends. That affinity included an appetite for clothes, socializing, and a cheerful disregard for the convention that gave their father persistent headaches. In November 1934, George was created Duke of Kent. 7 weeks later, on November 29th, he married Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark at Westminster Abbey, the first royal wedding broadcast by wireless, with loudspeakers outside the Abbey so the crowds in the street could hear the service. It was, by every account, The social event of its decade. 2,000 guests, the last marriage between a son of a British sovereign and a member of a foreign royal house. He was 31, she was 27. Those who knew them described a marriage of genuine warmth, which is remarkable given what George had been doing in the years preceding it. Sometime in the mid-1920s in Paris, he met Alice Gwynne Preston, known to everyone as Kiki. She was a Whitney by birth, beautiful, and by the time George found her, a serious drug addict. She took heroin, cocaine, and morphine, and carried a silver syringe with her everywhere she went, injecting herself at dinner parties while other guests watched. The nickname was simply descriptive: the girl with the silver syringe. According to multiple secondary sources, including Deborah Cadbury's Princes at War and James Fox's White Mischief, Kiki introduced George to cocaine and morphine through 1928. His brother Edward spent years trying to extract him from the relationship. Eventually, in the summer of 1929, he forced the issue, having Kiki physically removed from England while George was installed at Edward's country house and detoxed under close supervision. In 1932, George ran into Kiki unexpectedly at Cannes and had to be removed from the situation almost by force. Kiki Preston spent the remaining pre-war years at her house on the shores of Lake Naivasha in Kenya, at the center of the Happy Valley set, an expatriate community notorious for drug use, infidelity, and the 1941 murder of Lord Errol that Fox later wrote about at length. Her husband Jerome had died in 1934. On December 23, 1946, Kiki jumped from the fifth-floor window of the Stanhope Hotel in New York City. She was 48. Her mother was staying in the same hotel. Then there were the men. George's bisexuality was, as the period's historians describe it, an open secret in informed circles. The name most consistently cited is Noel Coward, playwright, actor, composer, the dominant figure of London theatrical life across 4 decades. The published Noel Coward Diaries contain a post-death grief entry referencing the garden at Coppins, the Kent family estate, with an emotional register that goes well beyond professional acquaintance. Cadbury, in Princes at War, refers to an alleged affair with Coward that led to audacious behavior. British security services reportedly documented Coward and George in circumstances that prompted formal concern. A set of letters reportedly had to be recovered from a Paris blackmailer who was using them for leverage. Also cited in secondary sources, Louis Ferdinand, Prince of Prussia, grandson of Kaiser Wilhelm II, a name that matters more for its political geography than its romantic content. One sentence for the archival subplot: Anthony Blunt, surveyor of the King's pictures and, as it later emerged, Soviet spy, is cited in secondary literature as having retrieved sensitive correspondence involving George from European archives. One sentence is what that claim warrants on current evidence. Here is something the standard accounts leave out entirely, and the reason it matters isn't trivial. Between 1934 and 1939, Prince George served as Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England, the governing body of Freemasonry in England and Wales, documented in a publication of the Quattro Coronati Lodge, the UGLE's own research lodge. His son Edward, the current Duke of Kent, was installed as Grand Master on June 14, 1967, during the UGLE's 250th anniversary celebrations at the Royal Albert Hall. Edward has held the position for 58 years. He is the longest-serving Grand Master in UGLE history. His Wikipedia page describes this as his most significant institutional role. Father and son, the same title. George held it from 1934 to 1939. Edward has held it since 1967. The significance is the network, not the ritual. The Grand Master of the UGLE in pre-war Britain occupied a position of considerable reach, parliamentary connections, military connections, aristocratic connections, and European connections through a fraternal network that extended into the German-speaking world. George held this role while simultaneously maintaining documented personal relationships with members of the German aristocracy. Official histories of the period have found this intersection consistently inconvenient to acknowledge. No authorized account has ever been produced in which to acknowledge or omit it. George's political sympathies in the 1930s are documented across multiple sources and aren't meaningfully disputed. Like his brother Edward, he was sympathetic to the political developments taking place in Germany. The Duke of Windsor visited Hitler in October 1937 and called him not a bad chap. The royal family's German relatives were almost uniformly affiliated with the Nazi apparatus by marriage or conviction. George met Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy Führer, and Alfred Rosenberg, the party's chief ideologue, during the 1930s. On May 10, 1941, Rudolf Hess flew a Messerschmitt fighter bomber solo from an airfield near Augsburg, crossed the North Sea, and bailed out over Scotland, landing approximately 12 miles from his intended destination, the estate of the Duke of Hamilton near Dungavel. He demanded to speak with Hamilton upon landing. His stated purpose was a peace mission. Churchill's public position was that Hess was acting alone and mentally unstable. Hitler publicly agreed. Both had obvious reasons for this framing, and both moved to establish it before anyone else could establish something different. Authors John Harris and Richard Wilborn spent years examining over 10,000 documents and published their conclusions in Rudolf Hess, Treachery and Deception. The evidence, they concluded, very strongly points to an Anglo-German conspiracy centered on Prince George. Harris concluded that it was, in fact, a coup attempt centered around Prince George. Their view, reported by SBS, the aristocracy had the most to lose from Churchill staying in power. All they knew was that Germany was bombing Britain nightly, softening the country up prior to an invasion, which would surely cost them their wealth, their status, and their lives. George was reportedly in Scotland when Hess arrived. In November 2024, the Telegraph reported that new papers may have substantially undermined the RAF inquiry's findings on George's death. The honest accounting is this. What is documented are pro-German sympathies confirmed across multiple sources, meetings with Hess and Rosenberg in the 1930s, personal connections to German royalty through Louis Ferdinand of Prussia, and royal correspondence sealed until 2041. What two historians concluded after examining 10,000 documents is active involvement in a peace coup. What remains inaccessible? The archives that would confirm or refute this. What Karina Urbach has stated about those archives, that after 1945, there was a big cleanup operation. The royals were very worried about correspondence resurfacing, and so it was destroyed. The specific claim that George conducted unauthorized diplomatic communications with German officials isn't established from primary sources. What is established is that a serious historical question has been raised by serious historians, that the relevant archives are sealed, and that some of the relevant correspondence may no longer exist. On August 25, 1942, Prince George boarded RAF Short Sunderland flying boat W4026 at Invergordon on the Scottish coast. The aircraft struck a hillside at Eagles Rock near Dunbeath, in Caithness, Scotland. He was 39. 14 of the 15 people aboard were killed. The sole survivor was the rear gunner, Sergeant Andrew Jack. Not Prince Andrew, who was born in 1960. Sergeant Andrew Jack. The official RAF inquiry concluded that the aircraft descended through cloud at too low altitude and that the pilot had changed the flight plan for unknown reasons. The pilot's filed flight plan had disappeared before the inquiry convened. The papers of the secret court of inquiry had also disappeared. A flight from Invergordon to Iceland does not require crossing the terrain where the aircraft came down. Unknown reasons. The inquiry's own language acknowledged a gap it couldn't or wouldn't close. George's 3 children inherited his title and his absence on the morning of August 26th. Edward, 6 years old, Duke of Kent. Alexandra, 5. Michael, 7 weeks. Marina of Greece had known financial instability before she married George. The Greek royal family was forced into exile when she was 11, and she spent her adolescence moving between relatives across Europe. By 1934, she was 27. George was glamorous and well-connected, and they married in front of 2,000 people at Westminster Abbey. By August 26, 1942, she was 36, with 3 small children and no husband. Hugo Vickers, the royal biographer, documented that Marina was the only war widow in Britain whose estate was forced to pay death duties. That detail carries weight when placed in context. 1942 was a year in which virtually every British family was losing someone. Parliament was reluctant to approve a substantial widow's portion for a royal in those circumstances. The political optics were impossible. What this meant practically was that a 36-year-old woman with 3 small children navigated wartime rationing without adequate institutional support from the institution whose name she carried. Marina trained as a nurse under the pseudonym Sister K and joined the Civil Nursing Reserve. She carried out decades of royal duties, presiding over Wimbledon for 26 years, representing the Queen at independence celebrations in Ghana, Botswana, and Lesotho, serving as Chancellor of the University of Kent from 1963 until her death. She raised 3 children who had no functioning memory of their father. She did all of this while remaining, according to secondary biographical accounts, cash-strapped for the remainder of her life. Sophia Watson's biography of Marina, the only attempt to tell her full story, was published in 1994. It wasn't authorized. Marina died on August 27, 1968, at Kensington Palace of a brain tumor. She was 61. Her estate was valued at £76,166. The apartment she moved into at Kensington Palace in 1954 cost £127,000 to renovate. The Crown paid for the renovation. The machine that managed what could be said about her husband also determined what resources she had and what public record he would leave. She carried herself with grace. The institution carried itself with calculation. Those aren't the same thing. 3 components, each documentable, each still operational. The first is media suppression, and its mechanics shifted across the period in ways that matter. In the 1930s, when George's drug use and bisexuality were most active, the tool wasn't a formal government directive. The D-Notice system, established in 1912 as a voluntary arrangement between government and press, was, in fact, suspended at the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 and replaced by direct press censorship under the Ministry of Information. What suppressed coverage of George's private life before 1939 was something structurally more durable, a voluntary alliance between palace officials and newspaper editors. Academic research on the monarchy's relationship with mass media in the 1932 to 1953 period, documented in Edward Owens's The Family Firm, published by University of London Press, describes palace officials who developed opaque channels of private communication with news editors, and a relationship characterized as a mutually beneficial alliance. Editors who cooperated received access and stories. Editors who didn't. A former royal editor speaking to the iNewspaper described the structural logic of this arrangement. After all, How do you write news about an institution that stems from the ancient idea of divine right, subject to no earthly authority? George V's first Christmas radio broadcast in 1932 marked the beginning of a deliberate public relations strategy positioning the monarchy as a domestic institution deserving of public affection. That strategy was running at exactly the moment when George's cocaine use was at its most documented and most dangerous. The two machines ran simultaneously. One built the image, the other protected it. After 1939, the mechanism changed. During the Hess flight in May 1941 and George's death in August 1942, wartime press censorship under the Ministry of Information was in full legal operation. Any reporting on a senior royal's possible unauthorized German contacts would have been a national security matter, not informal deference, but legally enforceable suppression. Two mechanisms, different in structure, identical in outcome. Silence. The second component is family silence, and the mechanism is the deliberate blurring of what is personal and what is institutional. No authorized biography of Prince George, Duke of Kent, has been commissioned. The Sunday Post's investigation was unambiguous. The palace and his family have given all approaches short shrift. Christopher Warwick's George and Marina and Sophia Watson's Marina were both written without institutional cooperation. Every substantive account of this man has been assembled around his family's active non-cooperation. For a royal of his rank, this isn't easily explained by personal grief. Edward, Duke of Kent, accepted a biography at 90. Tatler described him attending its October 2025 launch as characteristically stoic. That biography is about Edward, not about his father. For 83 years, the man who held his father's title has maintained consistent public silence about the man who held it before him. Stoicism is, after sufficient duration, indistinguishable from institutional compliance. The third component is selective institutional memory, the archival dimension of suppression that is the hardest to document and the most permanent in its effects. Index on Censorship's 2022 special report confirmed that historic royal files are unavailable to researchers with access denied for reasons described as absurd. Karina Urbach, whose archival research uncovered the extent of Edward VIII's pro-Nazi connections, stated directly, after 1945, there was a big cleanup operation. The royals were very worried about correspondence resurfacing, and so it was destroyed. Churchill dispatched a team to Germany after the war, called the Weeders, to find and conceal material documenting the Duke of Windsor's interactions with Hitler. Anthony Blunt was involved in document recovery in the same period. Secondary sources cite additional retrieval of correspondence touching Prince George specifically. The Cambridge University Transactions of the Royal Historical Society published a piece titled Censoring Our History, in which an academic described confirming suspicions of a cover-up while writing about the Duke of Kent's father after being refused archival access. That is the Royal Historical Society's own journal making that observation. The Rake magazine, in a 2023 profile of George, noted that the official papers relating to George, Duke of Kent, are still embargoed. The release date for some sealed royal correspondence is 2041. That isn't grief, that is design. On November 14, 2019, Prince Andrew sat with Emily Maitlis of BBC Newsnight in Buckingham Palace. The interview was broadcast 2 days later. He denied knowingly meeting Epstein's victims, claimed he had stopped seeing Epstein in 2001, and suggested a medical condition prevented him from sweating. He was 60 years old and had produced what many observers called the worst television interview in recent memory. On November 20th, Buckingham Palace announced Andrew would be suspending his public duties for the foreseeable future. Royal biographer Andrew Lowney, who has documented the institutional response to the Andrew scandal, describes a carefully curated narrative policed by armies of lawyers and PR people. Journalists, Loney documented, were explicitly warned that if they spoke to Andrew, their access to the palace would be cut off. Media suppression. The first component. The mechanism adapted to the decade. Armies of lawyers rather than opaque editorial channels, but the architecture was identical. Access as leverage, palace officials directing press behavior. The approval chain for the Newsnight interview was characteristically opaque. Mateless and the BBC believed Queen Elizabeth II had approved it. Palace insiders speaking to the Sunday Telegraph disputed this. One of Andrew's own advisors resigned before the broadcast in opposition to the decision. No single named person was publicly on record as having authorized the interview. Institutional opacity isn't a malfunction. It's how the palace maintains plausible deniability while still directing outcomes. Prince William and the Princess of Wales issued a statement that their thoughts remain with the victims. Visible separation from Andrew without explicit accusation within the family. William was described by royal journalists as refusing to protect his uncle, framing the distance as modernization. Family silence, deployed selectively, this time to isolate rather than protect. The machine isn't primarily about loyalty. It's primarily about the institution. October 30th, 2025. King Charles initiated a formal process to remove Andrew's titles, honors, and styles. Andrew became Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. By February 2026, he had been moved to temporary housing at Sandringham. On February 19, 2026, he was arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office in connection with his ties to Epstein. The Epstein files, released January 30, 2026, 3.5 million pages, apparently contradict his claims about when he ceased contact with Epstein. The Andrew case is instructive precisely because it shows the machine failing. The Newsnight interview undermined it. American legal proceedings created jurisdiction the palace couldn't control. Documents came through American courts rather than British archives. The machine ran correctly. The conditions had changed in ways that the 1930s precedent couldn't anticipate. The point of this isn't that powerful institutions protect their members from consequences. They do. That isn't remarkable. The point is that they do it without meaningful modification across a century. The tools George V's palace used in the 1930s, voluntary press deference backed by access incentives, the deliberate non-commissioning of authorized records, archival suppression, and the selective destruction of correspondence, are structurally identical to the tools deployed around Prince Andrew in 2019. No new department, no external consultants, no redesign. The same drawer, the same contents, the same combination. What changed is the environment in which the drawer was opened. In 1942, wartime censorship and a deferential press meant those contents were sufficient. In 2019, a disastrous live interview, 3.5 million American court documents, and an international media apparatus the palace's mutually beneficial alliance had no leverage over, meant they weren't. The machine didn't deteriorate. The world around it changed. Edward, Duke of Kent, turned 90 in October 2025. He attended a biography launch in October 2025. He has held his father's title for 83 years. His father's papers are embargoed. His father's authorized biography does not exist. Some of his father's correspondence becomes accessible in 2041. Whatever survives. Nothing has changed. Not the playbook. The playbook hasn't had to. Subscribe for more stories like this.